Hi, everybody. My name's Toby Camps. I'm curator of modern contemporary art at the Menil collection. Before we start, could I ask you to take out your cell phones and please make sure they're in the off position? That would be great. The Walter Hopps Award for Curatorial Achievement was established in 2001 in honor of Menil founding director and longtime curator of 20th century art, Walter Hopps. Hopps played a central role in shaping this museum, and he was a legendary figure in the American art and museum worlds. He began his career in Los Angeles, where he co-founded the Ferris Gallery in 1957 and was instrumental in bringing a generation of that city's artists to international attention. He later became curator and director of the Pasadena Museum of Art, and among the seminal exhibitions he organized there were first retrospectives of Marcel Duchamp and Joseph Cornell in the United States, and there he also mounted the first exhibition devoted to pop art, 1962's New Paintings of Common Objects. Over the years, as director of the Corcoran Gallery in Washington, D.C., the Menil Collection in Houston, and as commissioner and curator of the Sao Paulo Biennale and the Venice Biennale, Hopps presented works by artists including Barnett Newman, Frank Stella, Robert Irwin, James Rosenquist, Deanne Arbus, and Robert Rauschenberg. His obituary in the Washington Post described Hopps as a, quote, sort of gonzo museum director, elusive, unpredictable, outlandish in his range, jagged in his vision, heedless of rules. But he was also a consummate exhibition maker, somebody who really had the gift for making exhibitions sing. In fact, he compared the process of developing a museum show to conducting a symphony. The Hopps Award recognizes museum professionals in early to mid-career who have made significant contributions to the field of contemporary art and, like its namesake, curate outside of the box. It confers a $20,000 stipend. Tonight's speaker, Thomas J. Lax, Associate Curator in the Department of Media and Performance Art at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, is the 2015 winner of this award. He is the 7th recipient and was chosen from an international field of candidates nominated by 3 highly accomplished curators. These are Carlos Basualdo, who is the Keith and Catherine Sachs Curator of Contemporary Art at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and a curator at Maxi in Rome, Museum of Art of the 21st Century. Melissa Chu was director of the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, and Helen Molesworth, who's chief curator of the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. Previous recipients of the Hopps Award are Adam Simchek, Maria Lind, Unji Ju, Roger M. Burgle, and Cuauhtemoc Medina. It's presented every 2 years, the award. In a museum career that to date spans only some 8 years, Thomas J. Lax has won widespread attention and respect for his prolific and innovative work focusing on performance art, dance, and video, as well as socially engaged art practices in all media. Lax joined MoMA in 2014 after 7 years as assistant curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem. While at the Studio Museum, Lax organized more than a dozen exhibitions, as well as numerous live performances and public programs. Most recently, these included the Studio Museum's critically acclaimed traveling exhibition, When the Stars Begin to Fall, Imagination in the American South. Helen Molesworth, one of the jurors, noted that this exhibition, quote, suggested that there is a sense of deep time in African American culture that stretches back to the Middle Passage, through the antebellum period, into the long Jim Crow years, all of which inflect today's dreams, ideas, and realities concerning blackness. Lax's accomplishment was to choose visual and performing artists who demonstrated how these histories still inflect our present ideas. That he did so by avoiding traditional hierarchies, by refusing to make distinctions between work made outside or inside of the established art world, between historical or new material, furthered his expansive ideas about American identity. In 2008, Lax developed and launched the Studio Museum's Video Studio program, an ongoing series of exhibitions of time-based art, and in 2011, he initiated Studio Lab, a think tank and short-term residency program. At the Studio Museum, he also organized the exhibitions I.A. Aton, Space-Time Continuum, Ralph Lemon, 1856 Cessna Road, Lyle Ashton Harris, Self-Portrait, a collaboration with the Goethe Institute New York Off-Site, Mark Bradford, Alphabet, and Caleb Lindsay, If It Don't Fit, among many others. Lax is a faculty member at the Institute for Curatorial Practice and Performance at Wesleyan University Center for the Arts and serves on numerous advisory committees and boards of arts organizations in New York. His most recent projects include Greater New York, which just opened last weekend, the latest in a series of exhibitions organized by MoMA and its affiliate PS1 every 5 years that surveys new art from the city. This exhibition, which I hope Thomas will talk about, featured over 150 artists and took a new turn this time, identifying correspondences between emerging artists and established figures. He's also writing a book on choreographer and visual artist Ralph Lemon. He received his A.B. from Brown University, his M.A. in Modern Art from Columbia University, and is a lifelong resident of New York, currently based in Brooklyn. Speaking about Lax's vision, Carlos Basualdo stated, "Thomas's exhibitions exemplify a fresh approach to the notion of identity, which is one of the primary questions grounding contemporary art today. His work conveys a refreshing disregard for established hierarchies and existing categories and an enticing sense of adventure." Certainly, tonight's speaker is not only a representative of a younger generation of curators, but someone whose approach to museum exhibitions is original and incisive. So please welcome Thomas J. Lax.
Thank you so much, Toby. I really appreciate that warm introduction. And thank you to all of you guys for being here tonight. It feels like a, kind of homecoming in many ways. I've been here a couple of times to Houston, and to see so many friendly faces and new faces in the audience is a real pleasure. There are a few folks I want to thank publicly here. I want to thank Toby not only for all of the work that you've done to get me here today and all of the support over the last several months, but also for the many curatorial kind of signposts that for me in the making of this show that Toby mentioned were critical, including one most recently, The Old Weird America, a catalog that I poured through as I was making the exhibition When the Stars Begin to Fall. Similarly, Michelle White, who's a curator here, and her ongoing work with visionary and outsider artists has been a key interlocutor and somebody whose work I've sought to emulate and be in conversation with. I'd also like to thank Francis Lazar and Tony Martinez and everybody who helped make tonight possible. There are some Houston colleagues that are in the room or maybe getting to this room eventually. Dean Diderco, Bill Arning, and Valerie Cassell-Oliver. Valerie Cassell-Oliver, who's been a kind of mentor for me. The first time I came here to Houston was in fact to take her traveling exhibition, Radical Presence, to the Studio Museum, and she very graciously entrusted us with that beautiful project. I'd also like to shout out Ryan Dennis and Rachel Cook. Of course, the three jurists that Toby mentioned, Helen Molesworth, Carlos Basualdo, and Melissa Chu, I want to extend my thanks to. Their scholars and curators who I've followed to Boston, Philadelphia, and DC and the Upper East Side. And of course to Joseph Helfenstein for, as director for stewarding the Menil. I guess finally, I want to, thank Mr. Hops. It's as Toby was describing the things that he's known for, and I realize that I'm now in this genealogy. There are obviously some things that one wants to claim, and maybe other things that one wants to disidentify with, and you can kind of choose which one of those. And I claim it all, and I promise that tonight I won't steal it. No artworks will go missing off the wall on my account. I guess finally I want to thank Andrew Wallace, my partner, for the everyday. So this is the kind of origin story. I, as Toby mentioned, am a lifelong New Yorker. I grew up on the Upper West Side, Morningside Heights, not far from the Studio Museum, which you see pictured here, a museum that was founded in 1968 with the express mission of building a context for the work of work by artists of African descent. And here you see the museum in its kind of full totality. The museum, and I'll use my little clicker, thanks to Tony, is this building, for those of you who don't know it, right here. And it's a former bank that was built in the early 1900s and renovated to become a museum in the moment in the 1960s in which there was a kind of surge of culturally specific institutions. And you see David Hammond's flag here kind of emphatically announcing that this is the museum. And I think most importantly, you see the space of the street. Here's Jimmy Jazz. For those of you who know Harlem, you know that there are 3 Jimmy Jazzes on 125th Street where you can get a new pair of sneakers at any time of the day. You see a number of street vendors who are existing and selling their wares on the street. And you just see life bustling by. And I think in many ways, what it meant to work at this institution that sees itself as visibly and emphatically in New York City formed what I understand to be the role of a museum. You might also see our visionary director up here, a little Easter egg. There we are at the opening of 4, an exhibition I made in 2012. And Thelma Golden, who's been the director for about a dozen years and has been at the museum for 15, truly is a visionary director who in many ways built the kind of symbolic order that exists at the Studio Museum and made the work that I've done there possible. Since the museum was founded in the 1960s, the name studio has been key to it. The studio comes from the studio residency program, which was actually founded by 2 artists, William T. Williams and Mel Edwards, who not only wrote the proposal to make the space originally housed on Fifth Avenue have specifically a studio for artists to live and work beside, or really in back of where art was presented, but they also physically cleaned out the space when artists moved in there in 1968. And in many ways, that commitment to working directly with contemporary artists, to having contemporary artists in the physical building, and you see them, you can see the space here on the 3rd floor of the museum where currently they're located, has been at the heart of the ethos of the museum and part of my own training. And I think in many ways, you see my own commitment not only to working directly with artists, but actually following the kind of conceptual lead of artists in terms of how I've gone about making my shows. So in some ways, this project, Ralph Lemon, 1856, Cessna Road, articulates that really thoroughly. So here is an image of the space. What you see is our video space that's been somewhat transformed, taking these plastic faux wood wall coverings and bringing them into the space of the gallery, taking these plastic chairs and also bringing them into the space of the gallery. And what you see in the back is a man called Walter Carter. Walter Carter, as you may be able to tell, is in a spacesuit, and he's in a spaceship that he made in his home himself with his family. So what's going on here? Ralph Lemon is a choreographer who also works as a visual artist and conceptual artist. And for the last 12 years of Walter Carter's life, worked directly with him. He met him when he was doing research in Yazoo City and was told by the owner of a juke joint there if he wanted to meet the oldest living man in Yazoo, Mississippi. And Ralph promptly responded, yes, of course he would want to meet him. And they continued to collaborate together for the end of Walter's life. The work that they made together in many ways marks the end of their collaboration. Carter died shortly after this was done and functions as a kind of memorial or even counter-memorial to his life. Here you see Carter again. This is perhaps the end or the beginning of the video. You can decide that. The video loops and this happens at the moment as it begins again. And what you see is Walter Carter, who's taken off in a spaceship, the spaceship that he's made, and lands here in a barren field. This is a cotton field, and in many ways, this kind of landscape that he's situated in comes with the historical baggage of Cotton King, the kind of center of the plantation economy during antebellum slave period, and also as a kind of harbinger of the future, as Walter sits here, lays here, prone and kind of unsure if he's going to get up or kind of stay there of what is to come. In the video, we watch him migrating around a kind of post-industrial landscape, very much situated within both the natural ecology as well as within the industrial or post-industrial landscape. We watch him as his family works with him, very much in community, in family, to build this spaceship, to see him off. And we see his wife, Edna Carter, another collaborator, as she prepares to send him off. So what does all of this mean? Of course, there's the kind of persistence of the everyday, the persistence of the space of the domestic, and particularly of the Black home as the site that represents the past, the present, and in many ways the future. There's the kind of making good on a chance encounter. Ralph, who met Carter by chance and continued this long-term relationship with him. There's the kind of ground zero of what it means to be Black, and I would even argue what it means to be an American in this video. And I think more than anything, there's a sense of faith. And I think that idea of faith is both one that you might look to as a kind of apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic sense of hope in terms of what might happen, after the fall. But it's also one in which is a kind of faith and meaning, that all of these actions that you're seeing here, and as I'm describing them, they happen pretty much as matter-of-factly as I'm describing them in the video, that they all add up to something. As we look at them kind of quizzically and uncertain about what it all means, that we follow it through long enough to realize that art, and maybe something beyond art, just somebody living their life and making a spaceship, might mean something. In 2011, we invited Stephanie Jemison, who is an artist at the time actually here in Houston. She completed the core program and was an artist in residence at Project Row Houses, and making work at the time that was looking to the early 20th century and film practices, remaking those films in her own work. We invited her to Harlem, and here you see us on the left, my dear colleagues from the Studio Museum, Naomi Beckwith, who's currently a curator at the MCA Chicago, who co-organized a show with Leslie Hewitt, here Michelle, my colleague Lauren Haynes, and here we are in our little office at the Studio Museum. And Stephanie came to New York, and she conducted research about the history of maniac chases and escaped lunatics. The same kind of subjects that had persisted in her work that she was making in Houston, but looking at the ways in which those figures appeared in a Brooklyn landscape. The work that she ended up making, called Personal, is situated exactly in that location in Brooklyn and Bed-Stuy, where I used to live, where she currently lives, and very much a kind of everyday location. What you see here is a still, and I'll show you guys a clip from the video, and there are 3 actors who are professional actors, semi-professional actors, that Stephanie invited to participate in her video, and the video is shot in 3 locations. One is a basketball court, the second is a public park, and the third is a street corner, perhaps the kind of ore sites of everyday life, particularly in this neighborhood in Brooklyn. So clearly the footage plays with forward and backward motion, asking the actor to move backward so that you, as a viewer, are unsure whether you're watching something proceed or recede in retrograde. I love this one-way sign because it really reveals the entirety of the gambit, that, you know, the kind of falsity or the illusion or the irony of kind of time progressing in one way. And we watch this figure as he waits. We're not sure what he's waiting for, who he's waiting for, what the end point of his waiting is, but nonetheless we sit with him as he sits on his street corner. Looking at Barack Obama and Nelson Mandela here, Nelson Mandela's face half painted. Are we moving forward? Are we progressing? Is change awaiting us? Or is it something that is kind of stalled or being undone even? And in many ways, Stephanie's commitment to retrogression, to moving backwards in time, is something that has continued to impart onto me in terms of how I've gone about looking at the role of history and the movement of time. So in 2014, I had the opportunity to organize an exhibition, When the Stars Begin to Fall. And here you see it in its first home at the Studio Museum. It's an exhibition that in many ways also had a kind of Easter egg in it. And Easter egg, I guess the Easter egg here was that it was kind of about categories. It was about the ways in which artists are defined as outsiders or as painters or as performance artists or any number of terms, but it didn't name that in the title. The title itself is actually an African-American spiritual, When the Stars Begin to Fall, which names the kind of beginning of an era, perhaps a kind of moment of second coming, if one believes in that, or also just the beginning of a new day, dawn. And Romare Bearden actually named a series of prints after this song, and in the print he portrays a woman in her home with the sun rising, and so this kind of very everyday and, if we're lucky, recurring moment that continues to come back. As you can see here, the show brought together a number of artists who, while some of whom had shown significantly and many times at the Studio Museum, others of whom were new to that institution or hadn't shown there for quite some time. Here, just to go through the artists that you see, you have Carrie James Marshall's Frankenstein and Bride of Frankenstein. Next to Carrie is Minnie Evans, the second female African-American artist to have a show at the Whitney Museum of American Art. Here, Beverly Buchanan, MacArthur Binion, who's shown here in Valerie's exhibitions. Here, J.B. Murray, another local, Trenton Doyle Hancock, and finally, John Outerbridge. Artists who are from all around the country, who have some direct lineages to the South, others who haven't been to the South, but have family who's from the South, and still others who've kind of projected an imaginary sense of belonging or identification with the South. This work by J.B. Murray in many ways kind of encapsulates some of the gambits of what happens when stars fall. Here you see a work on paper that is part of a series in which he kind of both methodically and obsessively rendered with ink, kind of using pen as well as with supplies that he was given to paint, these kind of asemitic writings that he received from God, as he said, after in his mid-70s, he saw a bird fly over his house, a rainbow appear, and the face of Jesus, and from there began to try to communicate. So here again is the kind of possibility of communication. Can we follow him to believe the narrative that he tells, even if it's just through the kind of expressive capacity of the word or the gesture or the mark? Here you see another kind of home space in the exhibition, and I'll draw your attention to this installation on the left, which is actually a collaboration between a mother and her son, Jacoby Satterwhite, a young artist working mostly in video and performance in New York, who has used a kind of archive of thousands of images that his mother's made. His mother, who's been who's been bound to her house in South Carolina for the last 20 years. And here you see an image that she's made, the mother and child, the kind of iconic image that we know from the history of Western art and other kind of genealogies of art. If you look here, there's the mother and child. And effectively, what Patricia's done, she was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and in her home has spent time kind of building an entire repertoire of designs for objects to be made for the Home Shopping Network. And so effectively, this is a diagram. This is her entrance into another kind of commercial marketplace, and one in which she already kind of announces or prefigures her son's contribution by depicting him here. So by bringing together these different categories, artists who are coming out of traditions of painting and sculpture, even perhaps showing with blue chip galleries, other artists who remain kind of unknown outside of their immediate community in their lifetime, and still others who work primarily in different genres of performance, music, dance, experimental theater. This show tried to ask basic questions about what can this category called Black art hold. If that's the kind of gambit or the mission of the Studio Museum, how or why can it or can it not be able to put all these different types of practices together? What's at stake for representing a kind of Black aesthetic through somebody who might be diagnosed with schizophrenia or who might be incarcerated next to somebody who might represent a kind of model of what a kind of ideal type for a kind of master artist might be. And so looking at these different kinds of pressures, not only within the space of categorization of art, but also in the most immediate space of the home, how do these things that don't fit together actually sit next to one another on the wall? The show attempted to try to create at once a kind of spiritual space and a kind of home space, which I think in many ways those of you who are longtime supporters of this institution understand as the kind of place in which art occurs. So since arriving at the Museum of Modern Art a year ago, I have been working on an exhibition called Greater New York, as Toby mentioned, and it's a show that happens every 5 years. This year, instead of trying to articulate, the newest, freshest, hottest thing that has come out in the last 5 years, I sat down with my co-curators and we began to discuss what are the ways in which New York and the landscape of New York has shifted in the last 15 to 20 years since the show was originated? And in what ways can we think through the events that have occurred in the last couple of years in New York as a way of narrating not just the present, but kind of an ongoing or persistent history of the recent past? And I think in many ways, for myself, looking at the kind of ongoingness of deaths and responses through mass mobilization of African American men and women was one way to kind of think through what this present meant. And so, in looking at simply the names Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, Freddie Gray, which are at once kind of singular, they kind of, each one of these names doesn't quite even articulate the fullness of life behind them. But at the same time, in that refusal to fully articulate that, there's a kind of a recursiveness or a generality or a kind of shared experience of the kind of possibility or precariousness of what it means to kind of move through public space. And so what I'll talk about tonight is a few of the artists that I've worked with who, starting in the 60s and moving to today, have thought through the questions of what does culture look like in relationship to not only state violence, but also the way in which mass mobilization and the space of culture and visual art exists alongside those. And I'll talk about 3 specific moments. And I want to say that I'm not trying to look at how art necessarily illustrates social life, but argue that culture, including the kind of culture that occupies the space of museums, is the space where social strife actually occurs. It is in the space of culture. Hopefully doing a few things. One, adding to a narrative of trauma in the 20th century that looks to moments outside of the world wars as the kind of determining traumas that have occurred. I think secondly, questioning certain ideas of ruptures or breaks, and instead looking at recurrence and return, and in kind of looking at these three moments, encourage us to think about things that come out of the language of psychoanalysis. Return and recurrence are, for me, very much kind of caught up in a language of the psyche. And with that language is a sense of both desire as well as rage. And so how do those things attend a narrative of return? And finally, I'd like us to think about, instead of these kind of moment of events or ruptures, the space of the everyday, where perhaps the most intensified forms of violence, but also the things that we might call resistance, or even something better than resistance, perhaps culture or art, happen in a kind of ongoing way. So I'll start in 1965 in Los Angeles. And I love this expression, Black Los Angeles, which is one that I'm borrowing from Kelly Jones, the art historian and curator, who in her work describes Black Los Angeles as a place in which as a term that describes a place and a set of relationships as opposed to an identity of the artist. So she coined this term in thinking about her exhibition, Now Dig This, and that looked at this precise moment at a time kind of immediately after the Watts riots in Los Angeles, in which artists were attempting to think about what it meant to live and work in this kind of cultural location. Here you see an image from 1965, and as many of you already probably know, the 6-day-long riot cost the city about $40 million worth of property damage, and it occurred immediately after an incident on August 11th when Marquette Fry, who was a young African-American motorist, was pulled over by a California highway patrolman, attemptedly for being intoxicated. And what you see here is the kind of primary business district in Watts, Charcoal Alley. And I think what I appreciate of this image, and it will be one that returns, is that in it there's as much of what we see as what we don't see. And I think in many ways the kind of opacity that the blackness on the right prompts us to think about asks us to think about the ways in which documentary images show as much as they refuse to show. Along that lines, I would say that this image is also as much about Los Angeles as it is about other cities, New York, Rochester, St. Louis, cities that preceding the Watts riots also were sites of strife. And also, fundamentally asking questions about what it means to move from one place to another. So there were a number of artists who were directly affected, so much so by this event that they upended their art practice and would shift in a fundamental way to making work in a new way. Here you see an image of the Bodacious-Burr Gorillas, a group that was founded by Ed Burrell and a small group that you see here in 1968 in a Black Studies class at UC Riverside. As a street theater group, they used art as a means for political critique and also to inspire a certain kind of social change. They were active primarily from the late 60s through the 70s and working in the streets of Watts and Compton, going to the Watts Summer Festival, working with jazz musicians, as well as going to the California State Penitentiary, use these kind of grotesque or caricatural images of big government or big business and Uncle Tom or the LAPD as a way to kind of directly invoke a certain kind of social change in their community. Here you see an image of Noah Peroy, who is depicted alongside this piece of furniture that he designed and produced. Peroy was originally from Snow Hill, Alabama. After leaving Snow Hill, he taught shop in high schools in Montgomery and Tuscaloosa. He became a carpenter and then worked, after he moved to California, at Douglas Aircraft Plant. He moved to California to study at Cal Arts in the 1950s and became one of the first African Americans to graduate from there. Subsequent to that, he worked as a window designer at a Broadway department store where he was fairly well known in that community, and then worked at several interior design companies, trimming windows and fabricating furniture. In the mid-1960s, along with Judson Powell, he began teaching art classes at the Watts Towers Art Center, which you see depicted here in an image from the 1970s. And Peroy would become its first director. Of course, most of you know that this is a site in South Los Angeles designed by Simon Rodia. And as a man-made sculpture, this is all, the structure that you see here was all made without, kind of cranes or, it's bigger than the scale of the human body. It's somewhat monumental, but it was actually physically made by the scale of a human body. And I think in many ways that sensibility of kind of something larger than life or out of, physically beyond the scale of this world, but still produced by it, animated much of the work that Peroy did then. Of course, the center was also well connected to the Pasadena Art Museum, and that became a way in which a number of the artists associated with the center had a chance to meet artists who showed in that museum, including and its director, Walter Hopps. And here you see an image of Peroy and Hopps from the late 1960s. And in the immediate wake of the '65 riots, Peroy and Powell decided to come together and make a series of sculptures using the kind of neon liquor signs that were predominant in Charcoal Alley where the riot had occurred and were left burnt and readily available. They began to pick them up and turn them into kind of objets trouvés, found and ready-made sculptures that they then presented. Peroy says, "We were particularly attracted to these little mirrored pieces shining up from the ash. Neon signs had melted in the fires and formed little jewel-like objects. We picked up buckets full of these drippings and decided ultimately to have an art show with the debris that we had collected." They ended up having 66 works in the show, which is where the title 66 Signs of Neon comes from, and inviting just under a dozen artists to join them as well. And in many ways, I think this becomes a kind of signature or sign for what they did together. It uses the kind of sign of the commodity, if you think about the liquor sign itself, as kind of flashing, as in many ways the sign par excellence of the commodity form. And here they're in many ways then embracing that logic, but of course distancing themselves from it by showing this thing that is the result of its destruction. I think similarly there's something in the work that's festive and melancholic. If you think about this as a kind of memorial, but one that uses this sense of abandon that the liquor store imagines or prescribes, there's that sense of duality here. And I think finally you have a sense of kind of commemoration, but one that requires the participation of a number of other people than just one singular artist. And here you see an installation shot. The show traveled to 6 different venues, including to the Washington Gallery of Modern Art, where Hopps brought it in the late 60s. And you see the same image I showed you earlier depicted here. And so by bringing in photography from the '65 riots, it became the kind of social ground on which this collective venture took place. In addition to having kind of photographs complete the artwork, the artwork itself occurred in its first location at a gymnasium at Markham Junior High School in South Los Angeles. And one thing I love about this image is the way in which you see the kind of the life of this community represented here. There would be a series of performances that would be organized alongside of the exhibition, and in many ways, this kind of total artwork becomes exemplary of how Peroy would continue to work. He would say in 1992 that the primary intention of the artists in the exhibition was to focus on the objects being made. We did not intend to provoke. We were talking about art. That would demonstrate how within oneself there's a creative process going on all the time, and that one's life should also encompass the creative process. We were trying to experiment with how you tie the art process in with its existence. Despite the fact that Peroy had a desire to bring together the space of creativity with kind of everyday life, he, by the time the show finished its tour to the 6 venues and came back to Los Angeles, in many ways was a bit frustrated with its capacity to communicate in different ways. He ended up curating a show in 1971 at the Bronfman Gallery in Los Angeles, a very important African-American-owned gallery, and the title of it reveals his own sense of ambivalence about what art could do. It was called Niggers Ain't Crazy, Niggers Ain't Gonna Never Be Nothing, all they want to do is drink and fuck. And so in many ways that's a kind of ironic take, I think, kind of using a stereotype against itself, but I think it also reveals a certain ambivalence he had about what he could do working as an artist or as a curator. And the fact that a year later he would take all 66 signs of neon and throw them away similarly reflects his own kind of sense of limited possibility about the role of art. He would go for the next 15 years on to working as a social worker and policymaker, and in the late 1980s returned to art making, moving out to the high desert in Joshua Tree and making the Desert Art Museum that you see here. And in many ways, you could think about this location over multiple acres as a kind of extension of early 20th century practices that were meant to kind of think about sculpture in spatialized or architectural terms, like the Schwitter's Merzbau. You could also think about it in relationship to subsequent work by Ed Ruscha or Andrea Zattel that has occurred in this specific landscape, or the kind of proliferation of artist-run museums, both here in Houston, in Chicago, in New Orleans, and in Los Angeles. But I think what's interesting, perhaps for me tonight to talk about here, is the way in which some of Peroy's early experiences growing up in Alabama recur or repeat as he moves out to this kind of sense of unlimited possibility. There's nobody else living where he's living. He can go out there and create whatever kind of spaces he wants, and ends up building a series of architectural structures that refer to things early in his life, to childhood memories. And here you see a drinking fountain that's labeled white and colored, and of course, with the kind of Duchampian reference on the right, but one that also has a kind of acerbic sensibility. Here you see a work called Commissary, which attempts to kind of line up objects the way that you would see them in a store, and he was specifically referring to the commissary in his town in Snow Hill, Alabama, in which the store kept its residents in debt, and his family was perpetually in debt to the store until the store closed. Or this work called Shelter, which differently could be argued looks like a space in his home that he had when he was a young child, or some of the shelters that he worked in as a social worker. So why with this sense of unlimited expanse go back to these moments of trauma? Why relive or recur these sites that are troubled or fraught in different ways? And I think in many ways, he kind of takes up a similar interest, not only in the past, but in the space of the future. You see it in works like this, where there's a kind of sense of a spaceship or a kind of object that's fallen from space. And you see it, I think, perhaps most clearly in this work from 1994 called Spaceman. And this work, in many ways, that kind of has a figurative capacity or potential to it, but also memorializes, kind of looks like a tombstone, kind of abstracts a life after its passing. I think speaks to the kind of the multiple sense of time that operates here in his work. He made this work by constructing layers of cut and hammered sheet metal into this structure, and in many ways, what that does is not only kind of refer back to his early training as a craftsperson and as a designer, but also validate a form of labor that is aesthetic, but oftentimes relegated to a field below or outside of the field of sculpture. So by kind of naming this figure from his earlier life as Spaceman, displaces this character into another time-space continuum. So fast forward to 1992. This is a work by Danny Tisdale. And as many of you can already recognize, it's a work that depicts the 1991, depicts and reuses the 1991 Rodney King beating, which happened in Los Angeles, in which King was beaten by 4 LAPD officers following a kind of high-speed car chase. The event was witnessed by George Holliday, and George Holliday videotaped it from his balcony. And he subsequently gave it to a local news station where it circulated widely. As we all probably know, the 4 officers were acquitted the subsequent year in 1992, and their acquittal led to mass protests, which were the next largest protests since the 1965 protests in Los Angeles, in which 53 people were killed and the National Guard was called in as a way to stop the protest. Holliday's video was included in 1993 Whitney Biennial, so a kind of different moment of aestheticizing or naming this kind of found object as a kind of art object, or living at least alongside of an art object. And it became a kind of touchstone for much of the work of the period. In Tisdale's 20th Century Black Men from 1991, the artist repeats the Holliday video in a series of grid that looks much like Warhol's Disaster series. And by repeating this image, he at once accelerates its power, its kind of proliferation, and the way in which its distribution and multiplicity in many ways enact or affect a kind of anger and potentially a kind of violence in reaction to that, to the fact of this video, but also I think deconstructs its power. Instead of kind of having it materialize in one static or still image, allows for it to be dislodged or read over the course of its multiple frames. Elizabeth Alexander, the poet laureate, writing in 1993, in the kind of moment of public outcry and cultural upsurge in relationship to this, said that, quote, "Black bodies in pain for public consumption have been an American spectacle for centuries. This history moves from public rapes, beatings, and lynchings to the gladiatorial arenas of basketball and boxing. In the 1990s, African American bodies on videotape had been the site on which national trauma, sexual harassment, date rape, drug abuse, racial and economic urban conflict, AIDS has been dramatized. In each of these traumatic instances, Black bodies and their attendant dramas are publicly consumed by a large populace." And referencing a variety of sources, both present and past, she attempts to ask, as the title of her essay elucidates, can you be Black and look at this? Reading the Rodney King videos. Basically asking what it means to, in order to shape a sense of self, to have to look at this and know that one's own self is potentially fungible for the body that is depicted. In other words, that one's own physical existence is as precarious, even if not directly implicated, as what one sees. And she describes this quite succinctly when she says, "In order to survive, Black people have paradoxically had to witness their own murder and defilement and then pass along the epic tale of violation." So I'll show you another work made around the same time, 1992, Lorna Simpson's Hypothetical. And in the work, there's 3 components. You see on the right a grid of mouthpieces made from brass instruments. On the left, you see a photograph that depicts a cropped mouth. And in the middle, you see a fragment of a newspaper. I'll do a close-up. I don't know if you guys can read this, but this is the fragment in the middle, and it says, "Asked whether he would now be afraid to be a Black man in Los Angeles if he were not the mayor, Mr. Bradley paused, then said, 'No, I would not be scared, I would be angry.'" And this statement, I think, there's a lot in this statement. I think, first of all, Tom Bradley, who was the mayor of Los Angeles at the time, through this question that was asked by a reporter, is asked to separate himself as a mayor from being a Black man, being kind of a vulnerable body, which he kind of reconciles by pausing and saying, no, of course not. But by putting this question hypothetical and questioning you as the viewer as you stand in relationship to this image, what Simpson does is effectively brings you in as yourself a kind of body that's being looked at or a body that's looking, consciously squeezed between the mouth that surrounds you on the left and the grid of potential mouths that surrounds you on the right. The work, like many of Simpson's work, holds a number of paradoxes. You can see here the sense of difference and repetition that is depicted with this use of mouthpieces, each one kind of similar in morphology but distinct in where they come from. You can see the sense of, at once, an object that it references the body. It's something that, would hold saliva. It has biological content to it, but it itself is not a body. It's something that's mechanical or technologically produced. And so by collapsing the space of a machine and a human, asks you as a viewer to kind of think about the contingency of those two things. Similarly, the space of the mouth is one that Simpson has returned to time and time again. And I think here you can think about the mouth as a space from which the voice emanates. It's the voice itself as something that creates a kind of sense of a subject, of a political subject, a sense of selfhood. If you think about the voice, in performance, that's the kind of mode of authorship, the way in which one distinguishes one's own sense of individuality, but also of interiority. And by keeping the mouth closed, I think Simpson does something very different than what we might expect. She valorizes silence, or a kind of refusal to speak. The kind of generation of conceptualists and feminists from the 70s and 80s who came immediately before her, of course, through a kind of turn to post-structuralism, had used text and language in their work. And here, by reducing that text to this small fragment and kind of figuring silence as its own kind of language, shifts the way in which we might think about the capacity for language to speak. So in looking at the kind of continuation of voice, Simpson in 1997 would make this work 7 mouths. Then in 2004 would make this work 15 mouths, in which there's a sound component, in which there's 15 different iterations of easy to remember. So again, a kind of mnemonic or experience of recalling what's come before, in which the differences don't cohere or reconcile themselves. But I think in looking at, I'll skip that and maybe come back to that. But in looking at this grid, there are multiple references to the body. So the images, these mouthpieces that we see here could reference not only the thing that they are, but also be a kind of ear. And so as we look at them, does it become the thing that makes noise, that will be for the musician to produce the sound? Or in looking like another kind of orifice and looking like an ear, is it the thing that will receive the sound? Is it the surrogate for the body, or is it a kind of mechanical appendage for the body? Fundamentally, is it the giver or the receiver of sensorial experience? And in many ways, it's all of the above. In a 1993 article in Art Forum that was titled "Seeing for Miles," Greg Tate, the cultural critic, who was a Village Voice cultural critic at the time, wrote that in hypothetical, Lorna Simpson is Miles Davis, starring the lips of Alva Rogers, who was Simpson's longtime subject and model in her work. This room-sized installation swings allusions to the Wall of Jericho up against the wall with the LA Rebellion. Simpson is Miles Davis because she knows black can be oblique and still stomp a foot up a cracker's ass for breakfast. America's on fire, and Miles and the crew are in some posh studio hideaway saying, "Let's meditate on this in a succinct manner, shall we?" So you, as the viewer, are placed in the incongruous space between the single anonymous female figure and the surfeit of male mouths. And one is reminded here, and I think maybe even called into a sense of physical action, about what it means to seek the figure of a female mouth, whatever kind of preceding scene that might inaugurate or that might recall or elicit, and to be the kind of receiver of that extension. So fast forwarding to 2013, you see two differently mediated versions of black space. I think those of you who remember in the wake of the acquittal of I guess it was after George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of Trayvon Martin, the kind of hashtag Black Lives Matter appeared, and there were subsequently monochromes that would appear in various forms of social media, whether it was Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram. And one can argue about the kind of capacity of that, but just in terms of thinking about the kind of history of this monochromatic space and its capacity to elicit feeling or meaning, there is a history there. Simultaneously, you see the kind of mass mobilization to the streets of the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think what this diptych, in showing this, I hope to reveal is the kind of shifts in the way that the kind of mediatization or the circulation of images shifts how artists make work in response or inside of these sets of social conflicts that occur. And so rather than the first image in which you have a kind of documentary image of the street to the second image where you have a kind of circulating image of a video as it moves through a variety of channels, to here where the space of protest and the space of action has moved completely, or maybe not completely, but significantly from the street to another location, you can track these shifts in terms of how media operate and how artists respond. I want to just go back to show you that I've purposely put Black Life Matters here and not Black Lives Matter. Many of you might remember in the immediate wake of the Black Lives Matter movement, a set of debates occurring about whether black was necessary in front of Lives Matter, that we could just say lives matter, and we wouldn't need to qualify that as black. And I think that debate is actually less interesting than what it means to put life instead of lives. And Fred Moten, the theorist, describes that difference in the following way. He, in a recent conversation, said the following: so we need to understand what the state is defending itself from, and I think that in this respect, the particular instances of Michael Brown's murder and Eric Garner's murder are worth paying some attention to. Because what that drone, Darren Wilson, shot into that day was insurgent black life walking down the street. I don't think he meant to violate the individual personhood of Michael Brown. He was shooting at mobile black sociality walking down the street in a way that he understood implicitly constituted a threat to the order he represents and that he is sworn to protect. Eric Garner, on the everyday basis, initiated a new alternative kind of marketplace, another mode of social life. That's what they killed. So when we ask that Black Lives Matter, I think that what we do sometimes is obscure the fact that it's in fact black life that matters, that insurgent black social life still constitute a profound threat to the already existing order of things. Kevin Beasley, who's the last artist I'll talk about tonight, is a young artist who is in the exhibition 4 that I showed you early on, in which Thelma was kind of explaining to me the wisdom of the world. And he's also an artist whose work features in Greater New York that's currently on view. The work that's on view is the one pictured here called Untitled Harlem Matriarch, and it's a work that is made using a variety of materials, resin as a kind of fixant and kind of effect that gives it a sense of sheen, but takes the television mount and constructs a kind of dome that looks very much like another domestic object, a kind of TV satellite dish, and the kind of very expressively colored palette that you see here is made up of house dresses. Beasley went to the store on 116th Street where his matriarch, the Harlem matriarch, that is named in the work, would buy her house dresses, and takes those house dresses and kind of in expressive and kind of exuberant ways uses them as the kind of the ready-made color palette for his work. The other thing that I want to remark about this work is that when you get close to it, the kind of space that it creates is a kind of sonically semi-autonomous zone. So as you enter into it, you kind of are surrounded by your own world, kind of like a home, but you see everything else around you, and you're part of that sonic world too, kind of like a home. And so I will play for you the beginning of a performance that he made in the wake of the Black Lives Matter movement at the Studio Museum in Harlem as a way of concluding.
for no reason. Everybody, last one first. They just killed this nigga for no reason. Man, he did his motherfucker. Everybody in the street. First clown, killed this nigga for no reason. Fucked up around here, man. Come detail. Call homicide pulling up. Homicide pulling up. They said that this shit taped off. I heard the gunshots came outside my phone. Ass nigga laying in the middle of the street dead. Brains all on the motherfucking street. I wish I could zoom this motherfucker in. I ain't gonna cost this yellow tape. This gun line, boss.
So as this beat drops by DJ Theo Farish, who's a Detroit-based DJ that Kevin has worked with, we hear the voice, an anonymous voice of a witness, very much similar to the witness that that Elizabeth Alexander described, the one that has to kind of bear the truth of something that doesn't exist outside of the fact of one's own lived experience or known reality. And Beasley finishes after the beat drops with the following passage. Apologies, he didn't finish with that passage.
Mongo played good with apples after all. There's the channel card and technical in all words can say it's confirmation. Black music. Yesterday becomes tomorrow. Sunrise stands at the helm of the celestial arc, surrounded by the sunshine of luxury. Commanded and expanded by John Coltrane, reduced to a minimum when needed by the hood, seduced by muddy waters when Coco Wayne named the doodle, but the wolf wasn't giving up nothing but a spoonful. And then Eddie had that move to City Guild to Johannesburg with a bottle of blackness from the sign. But then again, this was all just Geechee recollections from Mary and June, the kind that Mongo played good with apples after all. How you gonna get respect without hanging? Even the heart grew afro when Dorothy sat down and Nina came around with that sea-like woman. That mini car silly, Billy called strange fruit. There's a channel called that ticket and all birds to say it's confirmation. More words than that. Sugar, sugar, salt, salt. Get on, get on, get on, get on.
Thank you.
Thomas, would you take some questions?
Happily.
Okay.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. You talked a lot about the everyday. It was a term that you came back to a lot, so I wanted to ask you a kind of series of questions around that. What do you mean by this term, the everyday? Why do you think it is important today in our cultural and political climate? And then related to the work that you plan to do at MoMA, I'm wondering how you can access notions of the everyday when you will be dealing with such diverse audiences for whom the everyday can mean a lot of very different things. And also within an institution that, in the eyes of some, has actually moved in the opposite direction towards more spectacular kinds of programming.
Thank you so much. So I think for me, the everyday, I would say it comes from two sources. I think one, my own roots in feminism and kind of thinking through not the home, but the space of what is banal or perhaps passing or repetitive or just occurs in the sphere of living one's life, whether it's about taking care of a child or whether it's about blinking or breathing, which are, I think a number of artists have kind of turned into the material for their artwork. And I think beyond that, feminists outside of the space of visual arts have thought about as important not only spheres of political action, but like ways in which we make culture, right? Like those are the spaces in which culture is produced. If you think about culture as effectively, the kind of elaboration of subsistence. So I think that's one major kind of anchor for me in terms of what the everyday means. And I think the other, is in looking at the work that we saw, there's a kind of return to a kind of fabrication of certain spaces that are semi-autonomous or at least kind of create their own relationship to a larger whole. And I think that in many ways that's just the way in which we can construct something that is better than a space of necessarily resistance. And I would say the same would probably be true for my approach to working at the Museum of Modern Art. I think that the Museum of Modern Art, one's experience of that place can, as you describe it, is kind of hegemonic or monolithic. And certainly I'm not going to disagree or argue with that. But I also think that, hopefully it's a space that, people experience and kind of come to experience, artwork and their encounter and engagement with what they see in a way that's differently conditioned by what, where they're coming. And I think just to think of one upcoming, or a couple of examples, I worked with Stephanie Jemison when I first got to the museum on a project that was called Promise Machine. And it was, a work in which for 50 minutes she brought together a group of singers and they processed through the galleries kind of in reverse chronological order. And the same everyday kind of experience one might have at MoMA usually was suddenly interrupted by people singing a kind of combination of gospel and R&B. And then kind of, while it might be a spectacle, it's a spectacle that I'm happy to embrace. I mean, that I think while certain forms of performance can fall into kind of uncritical form of spectacularity, I think that the ways in which we saw, spectacles transform to do other work, I'm thinking of that George Holiday video, as it becomes a work of art, becomes something that one can build a sense of space or interiority within. And I think that, that's the kind of work that I hope to do in that role. The other project that I'm working on is with Maria Hasabi, a choreographer, in which in a work called Plastic, she's positioned her dancers on the stairs as you first walk in, and so they look like they kind of are in these scenes of exhaustion or repose or these other what might be other everyday kinds of scenes. And as you encounter them, perhaps your own movement through that fast-paced scenario shifts a bit.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about this framework of trauma and recovery as the basis of a lot of the work that you're doing now, and also this question of performance in the gallery or museum space. And I'm wondering about what kinds of responses to trauma and recovery can be accommodated by a gallery space. When we think about theater history and in theatrical responses, we think of catharsis, so tracing all the way back to Greek theater, right? But a lot of the performance that I observe in gallery and museum spaces looks quite different, and there's a lot less in the form of straight out emotion, catharsis in gallery spaces. Is it because gallery and museum spaces are not appropriate spaces somehow for that kind of catharsis? You used a term just now also about uncritical forms of spectacularity or something. Is that a thing that you've thought about?
Thank you so much for that question. I would start by saying that in many ways, I think what you're pointing to about trauma and performance are actually is really fruitful in that I think they share a lot of shapes or congruences. I think thinking about the way in which both of them exist in some ways outside of the realm of documentation. If you think about, trauma in terms of its etymology, it means, that which is kind of impossible to represent or utter. And I think similarly, performance has kind of occupied a location that has been thought about as kind of evading or escaping the capacity to hold it as a thing. I think similarly, they both are things that repeat or recur. If you think about the kind of history of trauma theory, it's all about the ways in which through various forms of loss, melancholia kind of is a thing that makes loss return over and over again. And I think similarly, performance, rather than being something that occurs only one time in the kind of theatrical models that you're talking about or in performance, are also things that are maybe the most reproducible medium. So I think that the link that you're making is right on. In terms of the space of the gallery, I think, performance, at least in the way that I'm working, is something that can have different homes. I certainly know that something particular can happen in relationship to performance that's different from other media. So for example, Clifford Owens, who's an artist who organized a series of works under the name Anthology at PS1, asked Kara Walker to write a score that he would perform, and the score effectively said, it was called Rape Score, and found a subject, elicit them into unwanted sex. If they respond consensually, stop and leave. I'm paraphrasing here. And so to me, reading that or speaking that, it had a certain kind of irony to it, or it had a certain kind of critical capacity. And then as Clifford began to perform that in physical space, that was evacuated in different ways. And so I think that there's a way in which performance does, in terms of the kind of catharsis that you're looking for, produce a different kind of physical relationship or even sense of kind of containment in front of you. And so I think for all those reasons and the reasons you're pointing to, ethically, it's really important to think about those things. But I do hold out a sense of feeling or possibility for a performance happening in the galleries, whether it's kind of happenstance or you kind of go to attend, which can also occur in the space of a gallery, that there can be that kind of emotional or even sentimental or movement or passage of feelings through you nonetheless.
Thank you, Thomas. Oh, you have one more?
I think.
So you were talking a lot about the body, and I've just been reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' new book, which is all about the body. Have you read that, and does that play into your thinking?
Definitely, yeah. I think that text in many ways provides a similar model of affiliation or fility. I think the fact that the motive addresses to his son is key, and I think in many ways what I'm trying to do is think about genealogy, which is different from necessarily lineage. Lineage maybe comes out of more of a kinship network in which you have to have like birth and straight people sex to like be able to reproduce, but I think genealogy is about a form of kinship that's more self-produced, or perhaps, you know, like circumstantial, or comes together and goes apart. And so I think because that text imagines directly a relationship between father and son as the site at which that relationship to the body is articulated is really fantastic. I think, you know, for me, you know, the other stuff that the body brings up, anger, desire, all those things, and the kind of commingling are really, really great and important. And I think that, you know, in that book, he speaks to that in really exciting ways. Thank you so much.